G'day.
15 years, known each other. Why do I feel like I still don't know the whole story? Here's your chance today to tell it.
I have nothing to say.
He's been called Australia's Dirty Harry.
I'm gonna blow your fucking head off.
But just how dirty was he?
There was a bit of a war on.
Now there are allegations that the killer was in fact a police officer.
He may have shot up to 40 crooks.
You're a nice cunt, you just killed my friend.
Did Brian Murphy get a green light to break the law?
I've done plenty of things that some people say that I should stand trial for.
Or did he do what had to be done?
Murphy, 1 minute we're trying to convict you of murder, and the next we're giving you a Vela badge.
Investigative reporter Adam Shand goes in search of the truth.
Are you saying he was also paying Brian Murphy?
And finds himself in the firing line.
Do you think you're over-egging this just a little bit?
Do you think you're underplaying it just a lot?
I met Brian Francis Skull Murphy in the summer of 2003 during Melbourne's Gangland War. I got to know him as we walked the streets of his old beat here in St Kilda. He vouched for me with cops and crooks to help me get inside the story. His advice and guidance almost certainly helped me keep safe. And we've written a book together. So I do feel a bit conflicted about telling his story. But as always, balance is important in understanding my complex friend. Our story begins in 1971. Brian Murphy's been in the job for 17 years. He's a detective sergeant and already a legend. But he's about to have a very bad day. He and a young constable become involved in a fracas with a Melbourne crim named Neil Collingburn.
Collingburn, he was generally known as a slightly different kind of crook than most who you would meet on the dock. You know, the normal docker, one hand could cover a table. But Collingburn was more refined, dressed in beautiful suits, had very good manners.
The trouble started when Collingburn went for a drive in Fitzroy with a couple of mates who were also crooks. The car got pulled over by two policemen, Carl Stillman and Max Gosney.
Well, they find in the back of his car an almost new set of golf clubs, and their suspicions are raised.
The two cops, Stillman and Gosney, suspect the golf clubs are stolen and insist on taking the three men back to Russell Street HQ. What happened next in the police muster room was a hotly disputed subject.
There were a couple of versions of how this went down, apparently. There's the police version. What do we know of the police version?
OK, the police version is that Stillman, he was at the typewriter typing up his documentation, and apparently out of the blue, Collingburn launched himself at him and smashed him in the face. He went tumbling down onto the ground, from where Stillman says he actually kicked at Collingburn and got him in the stomach. Then Collingburn leapt about 3 metres across the room to start attacking Stillman again.
Until that moment, Senior Detective Murphy had no involvement in the unfolding drama in the muster room.
I told them to be very careful of the three blokes, because if they got the slightest chance, they kick it to death. Being Stillman left me with a feeling that he knew better than I, but that was his problem.
But it was about to become Murphy's problem too.
Now, Murphy, he hears all this ruckus going on in the muster room, so Murphy entered stage left and put Collingburn in the dreaded Murphy headlock. That's the police version.
Order, according to the police, was restored. Now, the key part of the police testimony, which was later disputed in court, was how Neil Collingburn came to be kicked in the stomach. The police said that Stillman had kicked Collingburn in self-defence, having been king hit and knocked to the floor. But that version of events was disputed in court. Remember, Collingburn had two mates with him in the car when the police stopped it. All three were taken to the muster room, and the two mates remembered things slightly differently to the police.
They heard Murphy yell out, "The bash is on." Murphy and Stillman were punching and stomping on Collingburn, who was on the ground. So it was like an unprovoked attack. Stillman used the heel of his foot to stomp 6 times onto Collingburn's face and stomach. So according to the two associates of Collingburn, he was bashed, he was thumped, he was squeezed, he was jumped on. His head was bashed into a set of metal lockers in an unprovoked attack. So ultimately, it was the word of 2 cops against 2 crims.
Collingburn, in physical distress after the fight in the muster room, was driven to St Vincent's Hospital by Stillman. A court was later told that he was denied treatment for 24 hours because of his aggressive outbursts against staff. This probably sealed his fate. The heel of Stillman's police boot had ruptured his duodenum, which plays a vital role in the digestion of food in the small intestine. Collingburn eventually underwent surgery, but stricken with gas gangrene, he died 2 days after being admitted. It turned out that the golf clubs the police had found in the boot of his car were not in fact stolen after all. He died for nothing.
On the Sunday afternoon, I got a phone call. It was a policeman from Port Melbourne saying, "You're a nice cunt, you just killed my friend." I wished him all the best and hung up, and another policeman came in and he said, "And Murphy, you've had better get out of this place because they're going to charge you with murder."
Murphy and Stillman were both charged with manslaughter and suspended from Victoria Police. When their case went to trial, it was a closely watched affair.
What did the jacket say? He didn't say nothing, actually. Just asked us why we're doing setting the car. We were waiting for the lights to change and said, "Boys, that's not strange. Boys, I'll tie your feet. Boys, we're going down. We're going down to Russell Street."
Compounding the drama, Collingburn had been a paid-up member of the Painters and Dockers, a union full of criminals and miscreants. It was no secret that many unionists wanted Murphy dead.
There were days that no one was allowed in the front seat with Dad in the car. Mum was, but none of the kids because there was a loaded shotgun in there.
Murphy's 5 children were all aware of the danger he was in and the distinct possibility he'd be found guilty at trial and sent to jail.
The day of the verdict, do you recall that day?
Oh, vividly. Lots of extended family came to the home. I think Mum and Dad probably had to go to court into the city by about 10 o'clock, 10:30.
I took Bernadine, the eldest girl, and Reg's down to the shed, and this is shocking. We had a chat about the distinct possibility that I may not come home for 10 years. And the tears in Reg's eyes, not mine, were about the size of golf balls.
Dad said, I need you to be brave, I need you to be strong, and don't go menacing your brothers and sisters.
He accepted the responsibility and He's the same bloke today.
In 1972, Brian Murphy waited for his trial on manslaughter charges. It was the toughest time of his life.
I went on a diet for about 3 months before the trial came up, and I rang Stillman one night and I told him I was on a diet and I gave him the smoke. So he said, "What are you doing that for?" I said, "Well, mate, if we go to jail, I want to be the fittest bastard ever walk through those doors, and the first bloke that has to go about, I'm going to kill him."
In the end, the trial jury delivered a not guilty verdict. The court accepted that he died primarily because he was denied treatment for 24 hours at the hospital, not directly because of the injury he suffered back at Russell Street headquarters. Victoria Police gave Stillman and Murphy their guns and badges back, but this would not be a hero's welcome.
We were reinstated by a fellow by the name of Carmichael. And Carmichael said, "Well, you've been acquitted of a charge of manslaughter today. That doesn't mean to say you're innocent." And it upset me. And that afternoon I was told I was going back to uniform. It was a form of punishment for nothing.
Back to uniform, just the way a young Brian Murphy started out 17 years prior, with the values instilled by his parents.
Both of them were the same. They both wanted the best for their children. My father had a shocking life when he was a young kid. Was a street fighter. And he knew what his values were, and he stuck by his values. And Mum was the same.
But she had a good streak of old Irish anger in her and a sense of order, and she wasn't slow in telling people.
That's right. She told people what she thought, and that's a good thing.
How much did that drive your personality? You were very close to her.
I suppose I picked up the traits that I thought suited me. And I was a bit hard to control as a kid. I had plenty of adjustments as I grew up, and usually from a strap or a clip over the ear, and I learned from it. And I don't have any regrets about the strappings that I got at school or the hidings that I got at home. They still be in good stead for the future.
When he joined the police, young Constable Murphy had no problem adjusting those he felt needed it, especially domestic violence abusers.
The first boss that I ever had at North Melbourne was a fellow by the name of Bill Banks, and he told me the first time we ever went out on a domestic, don't go back the second time. If the kids are under the table screaming, crying, wetting their pants, and the woman's laying down there with half her teeth kicked out of her head, give him more than what he gave them, and let him know what it feels like. I don't think I ever got called back a second time.
Brian Francis Murphy, what's your reaction to that name?
Now wry amusement, a character, very different from the average run-of-the-mill member of the police force. He was charged with manslaughter and was acquitted, and I believe rightly so, but one would think that that would have caused anyone to perhaps go into their shell a little bit. Brian didn't. If anything, he went a bit the other way, I think. Sort of threw out his chest and said, you know, here I am, larger than life.
Yes, after Brian had been acquitted, it was his first day on the street, and I had to go to Melbourne to chase down an alibi of a criminal. And Brian picked me up at the airport and was running me around, and one of the people I had to interview was being a groundsman at the Melbourne cricket ground. So he drove me there, and we climbed the fence and walked across the hallowed green, and Brian said to me, there he is over there. And this particular fellow turned around, looked at Brian Murphy and saw him coming and just ran ran straight out the gates, and I don't think he's ever been seen since. I said to Brian, what was all that about? And he said, oh, I shot him in the arse once.
By some accounts, Murphy shot up to 40 people during his Victoria Police career, none of them fatally.
There's a reason that Brian Murphy was known as Melbourne's answer to Dirty Harry. Like his father, he never backed away from a fight. And like his mother, he was quick to anger. He also had an uncanny understanding of human nature and a willingness to use his police firearm and baton liberally when necessary. This combination made him a highly effective, if unorthodox officer, one the crooks of Melbourne learnt to fear and respect. Do you remember how Murphy would approach this thing when he'd target one crook?
Do I remember how he did it? I can remember this occasion he'd gone home for lunch, and there's this character standing there in his neighbour's backyard armed with a screwdriver. Of all places to commit a burglary, this fellow decided he'd pick Brian Murphy's next door neighbour's place. Some sort of confrontation occurs, as a result of which this fella's shot through the foot.
I guess you're always that person who's prepared to do something about it, and sometimes to your detriment.
There have been times, yes.
In 1975, Murphy walked into a house unarmed to end a siege. For this action, he received the highest honour in the Victorian Police Force, the Valour Badge.
You'd gone from the so-called killer of Collingburn to somebody who'd saved a life, and lo and behold, they pinned the Valour Badge on you.
We were all standing to attention there, and he said, Murphy, 1 minute we're trying to convict you of murder, and the next minute we're giving you a Valour Badge. But, yeah, it was good.
Murphy was back to being a detective, running his own race by the mid-70s, and getting results, even if his bosses were waiting for him to fail. They thought they had him in 1979 with the murder of armed robber Ray Chuck Bennett. The story began 3 years earlier at the Victorian Club, when the bookies were settling bets from the Easter race meetings. Bennett and his gang pulled off Australia's most daring heist, which became known as the Great Bookie Robbery.
Get on the fucking floor! Want to keep your heads down on the ground. Anyone moves, I'll blow your fucking head off. Let's go.
So how much did they get away with?
Well, there are estimates. No one really knows.
Official estimates still put the haul at $1.5 million, but there are many in Melbourne who now say the figure could be as high as $5 million.
There are many who estimate with 100 bookies there after a 3-day meet, it was $15 million, which is so much more in today's money.
Ray Chuck Bennett was never charged with a bookie robbery, but the underworld was never in any doubt. It didn't take long for the Kane brothers, two of Melbourne's most violent criminals, to approach Bennett about getting a payoff.
Les and Brian were a little bit miffed that they hadn't been involved and probably wanted some of the proceeds.
Not surprisingly, Bennett didn't want to surrender any of his profits, so he sent a very direct message to the Kane brothers.
Police say Leslie Kane, a former painter and docker, was murdered in his Wantirna home, but his body was never found. 3 men were charged with Leslie Kane's murder: Lawrence Prendergast, Vincent Mickelson, and this man, Raymond Chuck Bennett. All were acquitted.
Brian Kane believes that it's Ray Bennett and his associates who've killed his brother. How does he react?
He's not happy. He plots revenge.
So Ray Bennett had a new enemy to deal with, Brian Kane. But what did that have to do with Skull Murphy? Plenty, as it turned out. Murphy was also a sworn enemy of Bennett. They had a very personal feud, which came to a head in a confrontation one day.
He said, I'm going to tell you something. At the time of my making, in the place where I want to, I'm going to blow your fucking head off. He's most probably the only bloke I've ever worried about. And I'm standing on the footpath and here comes Chuck, one of his mates, and he tried to grab my gun. So it's a bit of a scuffle. He's gone back to the car and he's got a shotgun, he's pump-action shotgun. And with that, about half a dozen Italians have walked between he and I. And I'm sure had those Italians not been there, I'd have been dead.
Your critics will say that was the moment that you formed an intention to assist Brian Cain to murder Chuck Bennett.
Not true.
Coming up.
Raymond Patrick Bennett was gunned down in the corridors of the courthouse. The killer stood at the top of a flight of stairs and fired 3 shots.
They were sure that I'd be finished up getting charged with the murder of Chuck.
The old Melbourne Magistrates Court in Russell Street, just across the road from police headquarters, was the last place you'd expect to see an execution-style murder. No one had ever been murdered inside a court complex in Australia, but that's exactly what happened in 1979, when Ray Chuck Bennett was shot dead while under the supervision of 2 unarmed police officers.
Raymond Patrick Bennett was gunned down in the corridors of the courthouse as he was being led to the 10th court to face armed robbery charges. The killer stood at the top of a flight of stairs and fired 3 shots, hitting Bennett twice in the chest and in one of his hands.
Straight away, there were 2 suspects in the frame. The criminal Brian Cain, acting out of revenge for Bennett's hit on his brother Les, and Murphy, who Bennett had earlier threatened to kill.
Now there are allegations that the killer was in fact a police officer. I was told about those allegations by high-ranking police officers.
I have to say, Brian, for someone who wasn't involved, you know a lot about what happened.
I dream about these things, but what I'm telling you now is I think one day it will be proved to be 100% correct. I think Brian Cain conned them to get into the city court one Sunday morning with the caretaker, and they did a reconnaissance on the joint, and they got into the garage where the police put their cars. They pushed the nails out of the corrugated iron, and once he shot Chuck, he knew the route to take and got out, got his car, drove away to, I'm pretty sure, a policeman's house.
So you're saying police assisted in the murder of Bennett, but it wasn't you?
That's right.
How did Murphy come to be a suspect? Well, look at the photo fit of the killer issued by police after the murder. A bearded man with a moustache and very specific glasses. Now look at this photo of Detective Brian Murphy, taken around the same time. He changed his appearance for a case he was working on. Hat, glasses, beard. According to Murphy, it was no coincidence. He looked the same as the killer.
And the day before, on the Sunday, prior to the murder, was the Italian festival in Lygon Street, Carlton. I'd taken Margaret and youngest daughter, and as we've approached this coffee shop, Brian Cain's come out with a Kangol hat, glasses, photogrammetric glasses, the same as what I used to wear, and a beard. And I reckon he was setting himself up to do the murder the next day and had been growing the beard for weeks.
Great confusion, it might have been you.
That's right. Brian was a very violent criminal. Couldn't have cared less who he hurt or for what price.
Murphy says when he refused an approach by Brian Cain to seek revenge on Bennett, Cain persuaded other policemen to help him carry out the audacious hit. To this day, Murphy denies any part in the hit, although he claims to know the names of other police who were involved.
The Police Internal Investigation Squad, B11, is conducting investigations into 2 police officers in connection with the Bennett slaying.
What they did that night, they went to my office, the Internal Investigations. They photostated every piece of paper and every book. They took the blotting pads away, did everything, because they were sure I'd be finished up getting charged with the murder of Chuck.
No one was ever charged over the hit on Ray Chuck Bennett, but Brian Kane met his own judgment in Brunswick's Quarry Hotel in November 1982. Again, no one was ever charged over that shooting. As usual, Brian Murphy skated through all this drama, but more strife was about to find him. He came up with a plan that just looks totally diabolical by today's standards. A state-sanctioned program where he cultivated informers on the public purse.
When we return, on the prowl at Mickey's Disco.
I love the music.
But was Murphy paid protection money?
He was getting under-the-table payments each week of $200.
Swimming in natural seawater has been drawing Melburnians to the beautiful St Kilda sea baths since the 19th century. However, by the 1970s, the baths were in disrepair and were home to seedy nightclubs where the underworld and police mingled freely. Behind me was Mickey's Disco. Murphy described it as the devil's kitchen, and he couldn't get enough of it. He could be seen 5 nights a week until 3 a.m. prowling the edges of the dance floor. All in a good cause, of course.
I love the music. I can't put it on tone. I like it loud. Down there I get in for nicks and I listen to what's going on. I hear the music, I go home, I sleep from about 3 o'clock through till 6 and that's enough. I'm a made man.
More than the Bee Gees and the Jackson 5, Mickey's Disco became an outlet for Murphy to run criminal informers, including the owner of the club, Ron Feeney. Murphy was joined in his surveillance activities by Senior Sergeant Paul Higgins. The 2 policemen took their plan to Frank Green, the boss of the Bureau of Criminal Intelligence.
Green used to give Higgins and I $150 a week out of the slush fund to go and shout villains drinks and whatever it cost us.
What you're saying is that this was effectively a black operation funded by Frank Green for you to infiltrate.
That's right.
The local scene.
Yeah.
Murphy made it his business to know who they were, where they were, who they hung around with and what they were doing.
I was a nondescript sort of person that just looked at everything and listened to everything and reported back to Frank Green.
Not so fast, says this man.
Ray, could you just introduce who you are and what you've been doing all these years?
Ray Mooney. I went to jail in '68 for rape, served nearly 8 years.
Did you do it?
Yes. Yes, I was guilty.
After serving jail time, Ray Mooney was employed as a bouncer at Mickey's, but he always kept an eye out for Murphy.
So what would he be doing on any given night?
Wandering the place as if he was a part owner. Now, there's so much evidence to prove that Murphy and Paul Higgins and other police were being paid protection money to be able to work at Mickey's Disco. Now, of course, Murphy denied that.
But you're on the payroll at Mickey's?
No.
Never were?
No.
No secret shareholding?
Oh, no.
Murphy says the only cash payments he received came from a police slush fund, and that gave him access to a whole new world of intel for Victoria Police. The dog squad would often listen into his conversations with the Crims from a surveillance van parked on the nearby Lower Esplanade. And there was plenty to keep them interested, especially when Ron Feeney hired an aspiring hitman named Christopher Dale Flannery to work the door. These were the early days of Flannery's criminal career. Later, he'd call himself Mr. Rent-A-Kill.
It was as rough as Gippsland, the whole place. But they took Chris on, and Chris's wife got the job as the receptionist. And one night, they had the listening device van on the other side of the Lower Esplanade. They're listening to everything. And Chris said, "That fucking van over there, I reckon that's full of coppers." I said, "Why don't you go over and knock on the fucking door, if you reckon they're coppers, and say g'day to them?" Because as soon as I said that, he said, "Pig's ass, pig's ass."
Through his connections at Mickey's Disco, Murphy heard that Flannery was planning a hit on a Melbourne barrister and businessman, Roger Wilson. Murphy reported the plot to the homicide squad, who ignored it. Soon after, Wilson went missing.
Mr. Wilson was last seen here at the factory premises at the corner of Currajong Street and Robbs Road in Footscray on Friday night.
Police would later allege that Flannery and two accomplices forced Wilson off the road and drove him to a bush location where Flannery shot him dead.
It was being rumoured that you had been retained as a hitman.
Oh, that's incredible. Just rubbish.
You have heard these, though?
Yes, I have.
And what's your answer to that?
It's just ridiculous. Totally untrue.
Flannery and two other men were charged over the hit, but they were acquitted when the crucial Crown witness, Deborah Boundy, mysteriously disappeared, never to be seen again. The atmosphere at Mickey's was becoming more toxic by the day. Ray Mooney maintains that Flannery, who became a shareholder alongside Ron Feeney, never liked having Detective Murphy in the house.
Chris found out that he was getting under-the-table payments by Feeney each week of $200. And the moment he found that out, he banned Murphy and all his cronies.
It was only a matter of time before Mickey's went belly up. Flannery moved north to Sydney to pursue new opportunities for his rent-a-kill business. Meanwhile, Murphy began cultivating a new informer, one of the most unstable and dangerous criminals ever to walk the streets of Melbourne. Murphy's relationship with Dennis Allen would prompt a new set of allegations against Melbourne's toughest cop, and Victoria Police would pursue Brian Murphy in earnest.
Next, is this the smoking gun?
Why wasn't Murphy charged?
In the 80s, Murphy cultivated a relationship with a homicidal drug dealer named Dennis Allen. He was the eldest of 10 children born to Kath Pettingill, the matriarch of Melbourne's most infamous crime family, known as the Clan, and the inspiration for the film Animal Kingdom. Dennis, an unhinged drug addict, commanded a heroin business pulling in up to $100,000 a week from this house in Richmond, while killing friends and enemies alike. A good example was his murder of Hell's Angel Anton Kenny, whom he shot, cut up with a chainsaw, and dumped in a barrel.
He's an extremely violent person. He killed people with swords, guns, axes, anything at all that he had readily available.
What about the murders? How many people do you think he killed?
Well, I think I know about 5.
Some say there could be as many as 13.
Yes, but I don't know all those people.
Amidst all this murder and mayhem was Brian Murphy, who was a regular visitor to the house in Richmond. He'd often come here with Senior Sergeant Paul Higgins, who he was still working with.
And this guy's a killer, a drug dealer, a killer, a really, really bad dude. But at the same time, he was comfortable talking to Murphy.
Murphy claims Dennis Allen informed on over 30 armed robbers in 18 months. But there was a price to pay, and Allen was the chief beneficiary.
Dennis would quite regularly receive phone calls from various officers just before a raid was about to take place on his premises. And there's absolutely no doubt, given the number of times that Dennis appeared in court on serious charges ranging from murder on down, and was granted bail time after time after time. And quite often, the reason that he was granted bail was because a police officer stood in the dock and said, I support this man's application for bail.
And the allegation has long been that the closeness of the relationship must have been about bribery and corruption.
Oh, yeah.
But are you saying he was also paying Brian Murphy?
I would be surprised if he wasn't. I don't have any proof that he was paying Brian Murphy, but I do know that there was a relationship between the two of them.
People often say to me, oh, he's this and he's that and the other. I said, well, OK, fine, you say that, but what's the evidence?
He frequently worked with the late Paul Higgins. And when I was in charge of internal investigations, I had Higgins investigated and he was ultimately charged and jailed. They worked together quite a lot.
Why wasn't Murphy charged?
There was not enough evidence to contemplate bringing charges.
Yet there was against Higgins?
Yes.
The investigation into Paul Higgins lasted 5 years and cost $33 million. He was convicted for taking bribes from a massage parlour boss. And even though Murphy was working closely with Higgins at the time, he was never interviewed.
Kel Glare, who's no great fan of yours, acknowledges they couldn't pin you with anything.
Yeah, sometimes you look for something that's not there. And that's what they did. You know?
There's graft and corruption, which is one thing the bosses tried but failed to pin on Brian Murphy. And then there's what's called the green light.
And a green light means you have the right to work with criminals so that you can gain their trust. And if that means breaking the law to prove to them that you've got their trust, at the highest level, we will give you the right to do that.
Who do you think gave Brian Murphy a green light?
It has to come from the top.
Ray Mooney. He says the reason why Murphy got away with everything was that he got a green light.
He certainly didn't have a green light from me.
Can you tell us whether you actually did have a green light?
No, that never happened. I never had a green light. Anything I did under my own volition.
Yeah. Do you think you're over-egging this just a little bit?
Do you think you're underplaying it just a lot?
Well, have you got one policeman who's prepared to back up your version?
No, of course I don't.
For the record, what was your relationship with Dennis Allen?
He was a ferocious informer. Informers, they're like cow manure or horse manure. Nobody wants to handle them because of the stink. And the bosses don't want to talk to a criminal. And this is the policeman's job, but it's disappearing as the days go by.
Manure, stinky to handle, but gets results.
That's right.
Still to come, the day Brian Murphy pulled a gun on his daughter.
I was half crazy. And fucking, what's going on here?
By 1985, Brian Murphy was feeling under siege. His policing methods were increasingly being scrutinised. He felt like his bosses in Victoria Police wanted him to stuff up so they could be rid of him once and for all. It was no accident then that he was assigned to a case that would quite literally send him over the edge.
Pavel Marinov sparked Victoria's biggest manhunt after wounding 4 police officers at Noble Park.
41-year-old Sergeant Brian Stoop was rushed to hospital, critically wounded after being hit by 4 bullets.
In June 1985, a Bulgarian army deserter, Pavel Marinov, became Australia's most wanted man. In multiple shootouts, he wounded 6 police officers. 1 never walked again. It triggered an 8-month police manhunt. The media called Marinov Mad Max.
He was consistently winning gun battles with the coppers, so that's why the job was given to the Major Crime Squad for a start off. And Murphy played a major role in that investigation.
Murphy threw himself into the investigation with a zeal that even surprised him. He worked on the case day and night for months and was involved in 150 raids in the search for Mad Max.
Police believe the 39-year-old former Bulgarian soldier had been sheltered by a network of friends throughout the state.
One time there was a raid on in Footscray following a report that a family had been harbouring Mad Max.
Myself and another detective from the Major Crime Squad, it was our turn to be cut-offs, which meant you waited at the rear of the building in case anybody came out the back. Anyway, we hear the entry, we hear the front door being smashed in, we hear window glass breaking, all the diversions and stuff. All of a sudden, a woman appears at an upstairs window, literally flying out the window, wearing a pink nightie, I'll never forget it. She flies out the window and hits the ground quite heavily. And she'd jumped out of the window herself. These people actually harbouring Mad Max.
So rather than face you in that mad bull state, she jumped out a window.
Yeah, but she had mental problems prior to that.
Murphy by now was facing demons of his own. He'd hunted down hundreds of crooks over the years, but Mad Max continued to elude him.
I was given that job because the hierarchy decided that I would finish up killing Mad Max if we got him, and they could charge me with murder. Or I'd stuff up that bad that I'd do something and get myself the sack. I didn't realise it, but I went from about 90-something kilos to 70 in a month. I'm not doing any more, I'm going to go sick.
Murphy was off the case and recovering at home by the time his colleagues caught up with Mad Max.
The gunman's flight ended with his death in a shootout on February 25th off the Hume Highway at Calcallo, north of Melbourne.
Murphy had been through a lot, and all his issues came to a head at home. He found himself exploding with anger at the smallest things and took it out on his family.
You got to the stage where you and Bernadine, your eldest daughter, you can both fire up at each other, and there was a big argument, and she slammed a door.
And broke the lead light. Mortal sin. And I was half crazy. And she went in the backyard and I chased her, and I put my gun out. And I'm fucking, what's going on here?
So that was a moment when you just said, enough's enough.
Yeah.
I admired Brian Murphy. He survived when all the others didn't. He survived.
He had his finger on the pulse to a greater extent than I think any police officer before or since ever has had in the in dealings with the Melbourne underworld.
I've done plenty of things that some people say that I should stand trial for, but I've done plenty that I most probably shouldn't have done for the betterment of the community in which we live in the state of Victoria.
Murphy says he did do a few things wrong.
It's a bit too late to tell me now.
It probably is, yeah. But I don't think it was in the way of taking money. I think it was in the way of outcomes.
You know, using improper means is never justifiable. Police are required to play the game according to law. It's as simple as that. They must not stray from that. If they do, they bring themselves into disrepute, they bring the force into disrepute, and they don't serve the needs of the public.
The guys respected him. He was a father figure to a lot of young fellas, a lot of young detectives. Brian was a classic fellow as far as teaching young guys how to do it right and stay out of trouble.
Ours began as a professional relationship, but it became a friendship, and I'm happy to say that. You're a dear friend of mine. How do you want to be remembered?
A husband and a father. That's all.